I was just going to do a very brief introduction and then go into my paper. Did you want to say anything at the beginning or save your remarks for your paper? Or
I think I'll save my remarks for my paper. I don't think we need, since we're all probably relatively informal and new to the online conferencing. I figure if we can all give our papers, then maybe have some sort of discussion afterward. We should be okay.
Sure. Okay, fine. Yeah, so at 12:30, I'll just do a brief intro of myself and get going. And then it's kind of long. I'm cutting it down from a bigger project, so but I'll try to get through quickly. I guess we're looking at about 12 minutes or so if everybody's here. And then I guess the suggestion was we could go into the coffee break time if we needed some extra time for questions, because I don't think if everybody presents, we're going to have enough time for questions during the presentation period.
And we might not have that many. I don't know how many people beyond the panel will be participating. So
right.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
And let's make sure to just have everyone introduce themselves and what school they're at, and maybe frame their paper as part of a larger project or a seminar paper or something they're hoping to send off to a journal next week, or just so we get a sense of what all of these projects are. And maybe after we're done doing our presentations, if we can all connect via email and offer additional suggestions if we run out of time for our allotted presentation spot.
Sure, sounds good.
Sounds good. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Richard.
Hey, sorry I haven't been on the first two sessions today. It's been busy, but I'll be here for this one and see what you got. Looks good.
I'm sure we're all busy with a range of teaching online, parenting and managing our households, and a whole bunch of other stuff as well.
Definitely. A lot of people remember how people used to say, like, teaching online, oh, that must be easy, right? But now I think a lot of people have learned the hard way, especially when you have to do it in an emergency setting.
Until you realize every morning you wake up with 30 emails.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I have 12:30, so since we have 5 papers scheduled, I should probably get started. And this is something that I'm trimming down from a larger project. I'm Anders Greenspan. I'm at Texas A&M University-Kingsville. And so I have a lot of interest in Ernest Hemingway, and especially his interaction with the historical figures. One of those that I'm looking at in this paper is Benito Mussolini. And it wasn't something that most people would probably think that these two very famous historical figures actually knew each other and interacted. But in fact, interestingly enough, they did. So I'm going to, this paper is a little long, but I'll try to trim it down and hit some of the high points, and then happy to talk about it when everybody's done presenting. The suggestion is that we will have the questions in the break period, since we do have 5 papers if everybody presents. So we probably won't have too much time in the presentation period for questions. So as I said, I'm going to examine the intersection of the lives of Ernest Hemingway and Benito Mussolini. And I'm focusing here especially on Hemingway's early journalistic career. We don't usually think of Hemingway as a journalist. We think of him, of course, as a Pulitzer Prize winning, Nobel Prize winning novelist, short story writer. But Hemingway began his career as a journalist, working in Kansas City, then working in Toronto, and then when he to Italy, moved to Europe, moved to France in 1921 after his marriage. He became a roving reporter for the Toronto Star. So Hemingway had his first experience in Europe, as many people know, of course, as an ambulance driver for the Red Cross in World War I. So Hemingway came to Europe for the first time in 1918, and he was serving on the Italian-Austrian front. The US was at that time serving as an associate power in support of the Allies, which included the Italians. So the Italians had actually originally been in an alliance with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, and then they had split from that and then had joined the Allies. So Hemingway was on that front, and in addition to driving an ambulance, part of his responsibilities were bringing things like candy and cigarettes to the men in the trenches. And on one of those trips, there was an attack on the trench, and he was carrying out a man who was injured, severely injured. And in the process, Hemingway was hit in the leg by bullets and shrapnel and wound up in the hospital in Milan. If you've seen the movie In Love and War, that basically dramatizes this particular part of Hemingway's life. And while he was there recovering from his wounds, he was toward the northern part of Italy, including Lake Como. He then comes back in 1919 to the US, and he gets married to his first wife. And shortly after their marriage, they moved to Paris. So this would be by the end of 1921. And he became a roving reporter covering European affairs for the Toronto Star. And he first encountered Mussolini in June of 1922, in which he wrote an article for the Toronto Star, which was entitled Fascist Party $500,000. It took place in Italian. Hemingway had learned some Italian. He didn't know Italian particularly well, but he kind of managed his way through it. And he spoke Italian with Mussolini. Mussolini also, of course, replied in Italian, choosing words that he thought Hemingway would understand. And Hemingway, you can see foreshadowing here of his career as a novelist, was very illustrative in many of his descriptions. He talked about Mussolini as a big brown-faced man with a high forehead, a slow-smiling mouth, and large expressive hands. So he's telling Hemingway that the Fascisti, who of course were Mussolini's political party, were 500,000 strong. They were organized as a military force. And while they were in fact a conservative movement, a right-wing movement, Mussolini had previously been the editor of a paper called Avanti in Milan. He was actually thrown out of that position when he supported the intervention on the Allied side. Of course, the position of the socialists at the time was that this was, was a war between socialists and capitalists. They really shouldn't be taking sides in this war because the real war was actually the economic war. So in continuing articles, Hemingway's talking about the Fascisti. Of course, that's the political party. That's where the word fascist comes from. Discussing black-shirted, knife-carrying, club-swinging, quick-stepping 19-year-old pot-shot patriots, he calls them. So, as I said, you can see a lot of his writing ability very clearly here. He doesn't really sound like a traditional journalist in many of his writings. And you can see that he's actually probably headed to a career in fiction more than in journalism. And ultimately, journalism didn't satisfy him. It didn't pay particularly well. So Hemingway, as I mentioned, as a young man, was largely apolitical. He was interested in hunting, fishing, having a good time, hanging out with his friends. But as Europe began to divide into these political factions in the 1920s, Hemingway does become interested in these divisions, his neutrality waned, and he became very clearly an anti-fascist. The next time he met Mussolini was when they were at the Lausanne Conference in 1923. By this time, Mussolini had become the Italian prime minister, and they were, this conference was about the relationship between Greece and Turkey, dealing with issues after the end of World War II, the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. And Hemingway was there again, was at a press conference with Mussolini, calling him the biggest bluff in Europe. And he criticized the emptiness of Mussolini's statements, commenting, study his propensity for clothing, small ideas and big words, study his propensity for dueling. So he's really starting to see beyond Mussolini and seeing that he's, kind of this inflated figure, but beneath that, there's not much there. So Hemingway wrote, it's a very dangerous thing to organize the patriotism of a nation if you are not sincere, especially when you work its patriotism to such a pitch that it offers to loan money to the government without interest. Once a Latin has sunk his money into a business, he wants results, and he's going to show Signor Mussolini that it's much easier to be the opposition to a government than to run the government yourself. So Hemingway published a short poem in 1923. This was about his experiences at the conference, called They All Made Peace, What is Peace? And he, one of the things that he noticed was that when he came into the press conference to see Mussolini, he was reading a book, but the book was actually upside down. And so Mussolini was sort of putting on airs of being this intellectual, but of course he really wasn't. He said, I used to know Mussolini, nobody liked him then. Even I didn't like him, he was a bad character. So Hemingway, of course, as we probably know, is in self-imposed European exile for much of the 1920s. He talked about the vanity, the shallowness of the United States. Of course, this was also the era of Prohibition, and Hemingway loved to drink. So I couldn't imagine Hemingway being very happy in America of the 1920s, because he wouldn't have had the ready access to alcohol that he did have in Europe. So many of his letters, and in preparation for this, I was reading a lot of his letters, which have been recently published in a Cambridge series. There was a previous edition of Selected Letters, which was just one volume, but this is going to be a multi-volume, covering pretty much all of his extant letters. And he talks in great detail about how much alcohol he was drinking and how much he liked it. And of course, Hemingway, ultimately becomes basically an alcoholic, and that ruins his writing ability and probably led to his suicide in the early 60s. So I move on a bit, talking about his classic novel, A Farewell to Arms, which is based upon his experiences in World War I. It's published, of course, in the US and widely available in other countries, but one country where it wasn't available was Mussolini's Italy, because of the discussion of the Battle of Caporetto, discussion of which had actually been banned in Italy. So Mussolini was very upset at the idea that the Battle of Caporetto would be discussed. It was a terrible defeat for the Italians. Mussolini had basically banished that battle from the national memory. So Hemingway in the 30s is starting to be concerned about the possibility of a future war in Europe, looking especially at Hitler and Mussolini. Hitler, of course, had come to power in 1933 in Germany. In many ways, he copied Mussolini's style. So we tend to think of fascism more with Hitler than with Mussolini, but of course it originally does come from Mussolini. But he talks about the governments of Germany and Italy, and he wrote the first panacea for a mismanaged nation sorry, that should say is inflation of the currency. The second is war. Both bring a temporary prosperity, both bring a permanent ruin, but both are the refuge of political and economic opportunists. So Hemingway becomes very openly critical of this political philosophy, which becomes more and more known as fascism. And so he talks about the Italian campaign in Africa, that especially the battle here in Ethiopia. And he says, remember that the Ethiopians live in Ethiopia, eat only one meal a day, while every Italian in the field needs a gigantic and expensive transport organization to keep them there and feed him the food that he's used to. So he's talking about this as a very expensive war in many ways for Mussolini. Of course, people weren't supposed to remember the bad things about the past. They were only supposed to remember the good things. And he says it's a dangerous thing in a dictatorship to have a long memory. So as Spain fell into civil war in 1936, Hemingway was very much a supporter of the Republican government there, the anti-fascist government. That government got support from the Soviets. The Nationalists under Francisco Franco got support from the Italians and the Germans. Ultimately, of course, the Nationalists, with the help of Mussolini and Hitler, won the war. Hemingway did go back, served as a journalist in World War II, but as another article that I have written indicates, he was actually involved in warfare. Irregular warfare, more so than he was writing articles. He only wrote about 5 articles during his time in Europe. So he returns back to his home in Cuba, and he continued to write. His military adventures were over, and his later years are dealing a lot with his friend Ezra Pound, who of course is a famous poet, who had supported Mussolini during the war, and ultimately was tried in the US for his actions and was sent to St. Elizabeth's Hospital outside of Washington, D.C. Finally got released in 1958, and then Hemingway died about 3